Bumpy Johnson. Power, strategy, and survival in Harlem. Harlem before Bumpy. In the early decades of the 20th century, Harlem became the epicenter of Black American culture, ambition, and survival. What began as a neighborhood of elegant brownstones designed for white Manhattan's upper class transformed, through economic shifts and demographic change, into something entirely different. By the 1920s, Harlem had become the destination for hundreds of thousands of African Americans fleeing the violence, oppression, and limited opportunities of the Jim Crow South. This movement, known as the Great Migration, reshaped American cities from the ground up. Between 1916 and 1970, approximately 6 million Black Americans left the South, seeking industrial jobs, better schools, and the promise of a life lived with dignity. Harlem, with its wide avenues and graceful architecture, became a symbol of that promise. It was a place where Black artists, musicians, intellectuals, and entrepreneurs could build something of their own. But promise alone does not pay rent. The reality of northern cities proved more complicated than many migrants anticipated. Jobs were scarce. Housing was segregated. Banks refused loans to Black entrepreneurs. Legal businesses remained largely closed to Black ownership. The legitimate economy offered little room for upward mobility, regardless of talent or ambition. In this environment, the underground economy flourished. One enterprise in particular became central to Harlem's financial ecosystem: the numbers racket, also called policy gambling. The numbers game was simple. Players would bet small amounts, often just pennies or nickels, on a 3-digit number. If their number hit, based on published financial figures from sources like the stock market or racetrack totals, they could win several hundred times their wager. The numbers game was illegal, but it was also ubiquitous. It was played in barbershops, beauty parlors, restaurants, and on street corners. It provided employment for runners who collected bets, for accountants who tracked wagers, and for organizers who managed territories. More importantly, it kept money circulating within the community. White-owned businesses rarely reinvested in Harlem. The numbers game did. By the mid-1920s, Harlem was alive with jazz clubs, speakeasies, and artistic experimentation. The Harlem Renaissance brought international attention to Black writers, musicians, and thinkers. But beneath the cultural flowering lay a parallel structure of power, one built on the realities of economic exclusion and the need for Black self-determination in a hostile world. This was the Harlem into which Ellsworth Raymond Johnson would arrive, and within which he would build a reputation that outlasted his life. The making of Bumpy. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905. During a period when the post-Reconstruction South had solidified into a system of racial terror and legal subjugation. His childhood was marked by the everyday violence of that environment, both systemic and personal. The nickname Bumpy came from a visible defect, a large bump on the back of his head, reportedly the result of a childhood injury. It was the kind of nickname that could mark a boy for ridicule or worse. But Johnson carried it differently. He did not hide from it. He owned it. In later years, that name would carry weight in Harlem streets, a single word that signaled respect and caution in equal measure. Johnson moved to Harlem with his family as part of the Great Migration. The exact year is debated among historians, but most agree he arrived in his early teenage years, likely around 1919 or 1920. Harlem was still forming its identity then, still negotiating what it would become. What set Johnson apart from other young men navigating Harlem's street economy was not physical dominance or reckless bravado. It was intelligence. Johnson was known to be an avid reader, interested in history, philosophy, and poetry. He carried books with him, studied power structures, and observed the mechanics of control before acting. This was unusual. Street life rewarded quick reflexes and visible toughness. Johnson possessed both, but he also possessed something rarer: patience and strategic thinking. He understood early that violence was a tool, not a solution. Used carelessly, it drew attention, created chaos, and destabilized profitable operations. Used precisely, it sent messages and established boundaries. This distinction would define his career. Johnson's entry into organized crime was not dramatic. He did not announce himself with bloodshed or spectacle. Instead, he worked his way into the numbers operation as a runner, then as an enforcer, learning the business from the ground up. He watched how money moved, who held real power, and where vulnerabilities existed. He made himself useful to people who mattered. Among those people was Stephanie St. Clair, Madam Queen and the education of Bumpy Johnson. Stephanie St. Clair, known as Madame St. Clair or the Queen of Harlem, was one of the most influential figures in Harlem's underground economy during the 1920s and early 1930s. She was born in Martinique and arrived in Harlem in 1912, eventually building a numbers operation that generated significant revenue and employed dozens of people. St. Clair was not simply a criminal entrepreneur. She was politically aware, legally savvy, and unafraid of confrontation with authorities. She sued police officers for harassment, spoke publicly about police corruption, and used the legal system as a weapon when possible. She understood that power was not just physical or financial. It was also about legitimacy, perception, and the ability to fight on multiple fronts. Bumpy Johnson became one of her top enforcers in the late 1920s, but his role went beyond muscle. St. Clair recognized his intelligence and began to involve him in strategic decisions. He learned how to manage territories, how to negotiate with corrupt police officers, and how to structure an organization that could withstand pressure from both law enforcement and rival operators. St. Clair's influence on Johnson cannot be overstated. She modeled a form of power that was not purely reactionary. She planned, she calculated, she used information as leverage. Johnson absorbed these lessons and refined them. Under St. Clair's mentorship, Johnson also learned the importance of community standing. St. Clair was known to help struggling families, to provide loans when banks would not, and to position herself as a protector of Harlem's interests against outside exploitation. This was not charity. It was infrastructure. It built loyalty, reduced the likelihood of cooperation with authorities, and created a network of eyes and ears throughout the neighborhood. Johnson adopted similar practices. He did not seek to be feared indiscriminately. He sought to be respected, to be seen as someone who kept his word and who defended Harlem's autonomy. This reputation would prove invaluable in the years ahead. The numbers racket and the economics of survival. To understand Bumpy Johnson's rise, one must understand the centrality of the numbers game to Harlem's economy. This was not simply illegal gambling. It was a financial system that operated in the absence of legitimate banking and employment opportunities for Black Americans. The mechanics were straightforward. A player would choose a 3-digit number and place a bet with a runner. The runner would record the bet and pass it up the chain to a banker, who managed the overall operation and held the money. The winning number was determined by the last 3 digits of published figures, often from racetrack betting totals or stock exchange activity. If a player's number hit, they received a payout, typically at odds of 600 to 1, though this varied. The appeal was obvious. For the price of a nickel, a working person could dream of a significant windfall. But the numbers game also provided employment. Runners earned commissions, accountants managed records, controllers oversaw territories. For a community largely locked out of legitimate business, the numbers racket was one of the few paths to economic agency. Money won in the numbers game stayed in Harlem. It paid rents, funded small businesses, and supported families. The operators, including St. Clair and later Johnson, often reinvested in the community, funding legal defenses, helping families in crisis, and contributing to local institutions. This created a complex relationship between the community and the numbers operators. They were lawbreakers, yes, but they were also seen as providers and protectors in a system that offered few alternatives. Johnson's approach to managing numbers operations emphasized discipline and reliability. He did not tolerate runners who stole from bets or bankers who shorted payouts. He understood that the system depended on trust. If players believed the game was rigged beyond the inherent house advantage, they would stop playing. If employees believed they would not be paid fairly, they would steal or leave. Johnson built his reputation on predictability and fairness within the operation's own logic. This attention to structure made him invaluable, and it caught the attention of those outside Harlem who saw the numbers racket as a lucrative opportunity. Dutch Schultz and the fight for Harlem. In the early 1930s, as Prohibition created enormous profits for organized crime, white mobsters began looking beyond their traditional territories. Harlem's numbers racket, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, became a target. Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz, was one of the most violent and erratic figures in New York's criminal underworld. He controlled beer distribution and other rackets in the Bronx and Upper Manhattan. Unlike more calculating mobsters, Schultz was known for impulsive brutality and short-term thinking. He saw Harlem's numbers game as ripe for takeover. Schultz's approach was direct and crude. He used violence and intimidation to force black-owned numbers banks out of business or into submission. He employed corrupt police officers to raid competitors while leaving his own operations untouched. He undercut prices temporarily to drive out competition, then raised them once control was established. Madame St. Clair resisted. She fought back legally, exposing police corruption in public forums and newspapers. She fought back operationally, refusing to cede territory. And she relied on her enforcers, including Bumpy Johnson, to protect her operations and her people. The conflict was brutal. Schultz's men killed several black numbers operators. St. Clair's organization fought back, but the resources were unequal. Schultz had the backing of Tammany Hall political connections and the complicity of law enforcement. St. Clair had community loyalty and strategic intelligence, but she was fighting a war on multiple fronts. By the mid-1930s, Schultz had seized significant control of Harlem's numbers racket. But his victory was short-lived. His erratic behavior and refusal to follow the emerging rules of organized crime made him a liability. In 1935, Dutch Schultz was assassinated, likely on orders from the newly formed National Crime Syndicate, a coalition of major mob figures seeking to reduce chaos and increase profitability. Schultz's death changed everything. Into the vacuum stepped a different kind of operator, Charles Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano and the politics of coexistence. Lucky Luciano was the antithesis of Dutch Schultz. Where Schultz was impulsive and violent, Luciano was calculating and pragmatic. Luciano had been instrumental in reorganizing Italian-American organized crime, moving away from old-world hierarchies and blood feuds toward a more corporate structure based on mutual profit and shared territories. Luciano understood that controlling Harlem required cooperation, not conquest. The community would not accept a white mob boss imposing control through violence alone. Harlem's residents knew the streets, knew the customers, and could make operations impossible through non-cooperation or informing to authorities. Moreover, Luciano recognized that the existing operators, including Bumpy Johnson, possessed valuable knowledge and networks. What emerged was an arrangement, not a takeover. The Italian mob would take a percentage of Harlem's numbers profits in exchange for protection, political connections, and insulation from law enforcement. In return, black operators like Johnson would maintain day-to-day control, manage community relations, and ensure smooth operations. This arrangement was not equal. The Italian mob held structural advantages: political connections, relationships with law enforcement, and superior firepower. But it was also not pure subjugation. Johnson and others retained significant autonomy and profit. They were partners, albeit junior partners, in a larger enterprise. Bumpy Johnson became the primary liaison between Harlem's black operators and Luciano's organization. This role required diplomatic skill, cultural fluency in both worlds, and the ability to negotiate terms that protected Harlem's interests while satisfying the mob's demands. Johnson's relationship with Luciano was built on mutual respect. Luciano valued Johnson's intelligence, his ability to maintain order without unnecessary violence, and his deep understanding of Harlem's social dynamics. Johnson, in turn, recognized that working with Luciano provided stability and protection from other predatory mobsters. This was not friendship, it was business. But within the context of organized crime, it represented an unusual degree of respect across racial lines. Johnson was not a subordinate in the traditional sense. He was a power broker, representing Harlem's interests and negotiating terms that allowed the community's underground economy to function with relative autonomy. This period, from the late 1930s through the 1940s, represented the height of Johnson's influence. He controlled significant portions of Harlem's numbers operations, maintained relationships with major organized crime figures, and was respected within the community as someone who defended black interests within a hostile system. But power, especially illegal power, is never permanent. Imprisonment and the durability of reputation. Bumpy Johnson's career was punctuated by multiple arrests and prison sentences. Operating outside the law, no matter how carefully, inevitably led to legal consequences. Johnson served time in various facilities, including a stint at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in the 1950s. Prison did not diminish Johnson's reputation. In some ways, it enhanced it. Stories circulated about his behavior inside, about his refusal to be intimidated, about his intelligence and composure under pressure. Whether all these stories were accurate is less important than the fact that they circulated and were believed. Reputation, in the world Johnson inhabited, was a form of capital. It could be spent, invested, and grown even from behind bars. During his incarcerations, Johnson remained connected to Harlem through letters, intermediaries, and the networks he had built. Power in organized crime is not purely positional. It is relational. Johnson's relationships, his reputation for keeping his word, and the loyalty he had cultivated meant that his influence persisted, even when he could not exercise it directly. When Johnson returned to Harlem after prison sentences, he found a neighborhood that had changed. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. Urban renewal projects were beginning to displace communities. The drug trade, particularly heroin, was rising in prominence and would soon overshadow traditional rackets like numbers gambling. Johnson adapted. He maintained his numbers operations, but also became involved in other enterprises. His role increasingly became that of elder statesman, mediator, and strategic advisor, rather than hands-on operator. Younger figures were rising, including Frank Lucas, who would later claim a closer relationship with Johnson than evidence suggests. What remained constant was Johnson's approach: calculated, disciplined, focused on long-term positioning rather than short-term gain. He avoided the flashiness and recklessness that drew law enforcement attention. He maintained relationships across racial and organizational lines. He positioned himself as indispensable, the person who could make deals happen and prevent conflicts from escalating. This was power without spectacle, influence exercised through networks rather than force. It was a form of authority that required intelligence and restraint, qualities Johnson possessed in abundance. The man behind the reputation. Understanding Bumpy Johnson requires looking beyond the criminal activities to the person. Multiple accounts describe Johnson as well-read, articulate, and thoughtful. He was known to quote poetry, to discuss history and politics, and to maintain a personal library. This was not common among street-level criminals, and it set him apart. Johnson's love of reading was not affectation. It reflected a genuine intellectual curiosity and a desire to understand the forces shaping society. He read about power, about history, about the struggles of colonized peoples. He saw parallels between his own fight for autonomy in Harlem and larger struggles for self-determination around the world. This intellectual dimension informed his approach to power. Johnson understood that violence was the least sophisticated tool available. It was necessary at times, but it was also expensive, risky, and difficult to control. Better to build systems that made violence unnecessary, to create incentives for cooperation, to establish reputation that made challenges less likely. Johnson was also known for loyalty. He protected those who worked for him, provided for families of associates who were killed or imprisoned, and maintained relationships over decades. This loyalty was not sentimentality, it was strategic. Loyalty builds trust, and trust reduces the need for constant surveillance and enforcement. At the same time, Johnson was not naive. He understood betrayal and dealt with it harshly when necessary. But he preferred to structure situations so that betrayal was costly and cooperation was rewarded. This required constant attention to incentives, relationships, and perception. Johnson's personal code emphasized respect over fear. Fear is effective but exhausting. It requires constant reinforcement through violence and intimidation. Respect, earned through consistency, fairness within agreed-upon rules, and demonstrated competence, is more durable. People who respect you are more likely to cooperate voluntarily, to warn you of threats, and to defend your reputation. This is not to romanticize Johnson or his activities. He was involved in illegal enterprises that caused harm. The numbers racket, while economically significant to Harlem, was still exploitative gambling. Johnson's enforcement of territory involved violence. His world was built on activities that damaged individuals and families. But within that context, Johnson's approach was notably different from many of his contemporaries. He was strategic where others were reactive, disciplined where others were impulsive, and focused on long-term stability where others sought short-term gain. The end of an era. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968. He suffered a heart attack while eating at Wells Restaurant in Harlem, collapsing at the table. He was 62 years old. His death marked the end of an era in Harlem's underworld. The late 1960s were a period of profound change in Harlem and in Black America more broadly. The civil rights movement had achieved significant legal victories, but it also exposed the limitations of legal equality without economic power. Urban rebellions had erupted in cities across the country, including Harlem itself. The drug trade, particularly heroin, was devastating communities, and a new generation of criminals, less disciplined and more violent, was emerging. Johnson's death left a vacuum. The structures he had maintained, the relationships he had brokered, and the order he had enforced began to fracture. Frank Lucas, who later gained notoriety and whose story was dramatized in the film American Gangster, was one of several figures who attempted to fill that vacuum. Lucas claimed a close mentor relationship with Johnson, though evidence for this is limited and disputed by those who knew Johnson. What is clear is that the post-Johnson era in Harlem was more chaotic, more violent, and ultimately more destructive to the community. The numbers racket declined as state lotteries were legalized, removing the economic foundation that had supported much of the underground economy. Heroin and later crack cocaine became the dominant illegal enterprises. But unlike numbers gambling, these drugs devastated the communities where they were sold. Johnson's death also coincided with broader changes in organized crime. The Italian mob's power was waning due to law enforcement pressure, internal conflicts, and changing demographics. The centralized, hierarchical structures that had characterized mid-century organized crime were giving way to more fragmented, network-based operations. In retrospect, Johnson's era represented a particular moment in time when organized crime in black communities maintained some connection to community welfare, when intelligence and strategy could substitute for raw violence, and when cross-racial cooperation in illegal enterprise was possible despite pervasive racism in legal society. That moment passed. What followed was often more destructive, more nihilistic, and more disconnected from any notion of community interest or long-term thinking. Legacy and lessons. Bumpy Johnson's legacy is complicated and contested. To some, he represents black resistance and self-determination in an era of limited options. To others, he is simply a criminal whose activities harmed his own community. Both perspectives contain truth. Johnson operated in a context where legitimate paths to economic and political power were largely closed to black Americans. The numbers racket, while illegal, functioned as an alternative economic system that provided employment, circulated capital within the community, and created space for black entrepreneurship. Johnson's role in maintaining and protecting that system can be seen as a form of community defense. At the same time, gambling addiction caused real harm to individuals and families. Enforcement of territory involved violence. The criminal economy, however embedded in community life, still operated outside the law and beyond the protections legal businesses enjoy. What distinguishes Johnson from many other criminals is the strategic intelligence he brought to his work and the code he maintained. He was not a sociopath or a sadist. He did not glory in violence or seek attention. He built systems, maintained relationships, and operated with a long-term perspective, unusual in criminal enterprise. This approach offers lessons that extend beyond crime. Johnson understood that sustainable power requires legitimacy, that violence is expensive and destabilizing, that reputation is capital, and that intelligence gathering and strategic thinking often matter more than physical force. Modern audiences often misunderstand Johnson's story. Popular culture tends to emphasize violence and drama, creating mythologized versions of his life that bear little resemblance to the historical record. Films and television shows invent confrontations, exaggerate body counts, and create simplified narratives of good and evil that miss the complexity of Johnson's actual life. The real Bumpy Johnson was more interesting than the myth. He was a man of considerable intelligence, operating in a constrained environment, making choices within a limited set of options, and building a form of power that lasted decades precisely because it was based on calculation rather than impulse. Understanding Johnson requires understanding Harlem in the mid-20th century. A community of enormous cultural richness and economic deprivation, of talented people systematically excluded from legitimate opportunity, of corruption and survival existing side by side. In that context, Johnson was neither hero nor simple villain. He was a product of his environment who used his considerable gifts to navigate an impossible situation and build something that endured. His story raises questions about power, about community, about the relationship between legal and moral legitimacy, and about what people do when the system offers them no legitimate path forward. These questions remain relevant. Economic exclusion, over-policing, and limited opportunity continue to shape communities across America. The specific circumstances have changed, but the underlying dynamics persist. Bumpy Johnson died more than 50 years ago, but his name still carries weight in Harlem. Older residents remember him or remember those who knew him. His reputation survived because it was based on something more than fear or spectacle. It was based on a particular form of power, strategic, disciplined, and effective. In the end, Johnson's life illustrates a fundamental truth about power. It is not simply taken or held through force. Real power is built through relationships, maintained through consistency, and exercised through intelligence. These principles apply regardless of whether the power in question is legal or illegal, legitimate or underground. Bumpy Johnson understood this. It is why his name endures, while so many of his contemporaries are forgotten. Not because he was the most violent, or the most flamboyant, or the wealthiest, but because he was the most strategic, the most disciplined, and in his own way, the most intelligent operator of his era. His story, stripped of myth and exaggeration, is the story of what intelligence and discipline can achieve, even in the most constrained circumstances, and the complicated legacy that results when those qualities are applied to an illegal enterprise in a community denied legitimate alternatives. That is the real story of Bumpy Johnson. Not a fairy tale of invincibility or a simple condemnation of criminality, but a complex historical account of one man's navigation of an impossible situation, and the mark he left on Harlem and American history.